what if we don't take this action, right?
Exactly.
What's the risk of standing still here? What's the risk to the business? And oftentimes, in my view, I think that can be the greater risk here.
Welcome back to CZ and Friends, where we talk with legal leaders, technologists, and operators driving innovation and excellence in their companies and beyond. I'm your host, Tricia Kinney. As a former GC, founder, and now AI exec, I know that as lawyers and business leaders, we love to keep up and stay curious and learn more about businesses and the people driving them, and do that while leading and getting better at what we do. That's what this show is about. Today's guest is Tricia Kinney. She's a seasoned C-suite executive and general counsel with over 20 years of global experience across private and public companies, lots that you've heard of. She was the general counsel and corporate secretary of BlueLinx Corporation out of Atlanta. It's a leading North American building products distributor. She led legal, compliance, risk, global trade, and corporate communications. Previously, Tricia served as the chief legal and compliance officer at ServiceMaster and spent over a decade at Kimberly-Clark, the leading consumer packaged goods company, where she led legal strategy for both their global supply chain and their professional services business units. Her track record across board advisory, governance, litigation, and organizational transformation globally and at scale. In this episode, we're talking about what it takes to lead legal as an executive, build high-performing teams, guide through complexity, and scale trust inside the business. All right, so excited. Let's get into it. Welcome, Tricia.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me.
Awesome. So glad you're here. So you've led legal, compliance, risk, trade, comms at public companies, at private companies. What does that look like day to day as an executive in that environment?
I mean, day to day, it looks different on from one day to the next. You know, you're in a super dynamic global environment, and that can vary, particularly given what we're all facing, you know, nowadays with on the global landscape. Partly, though, I'd say like if you're kind of dividing what you're, you know, where you're spending your time, the vast majority of the time I'm spending is how am I helping my team and coaching my team and unlocking whatever obstacles may be in front of them so that they're successful. And then it's significant engagement with the other leadership team members, engagement with the board, and constantly focusing on where are our customers, where are our investors, how are we putting our employees first.
I love that. So when you first take on a role, either a GC role or really any role, what are some of the first things you do to kind of like both as a lawyer and on the business to kind of survey what's going on, get in there, get in with the team? How do you approach that?
Yeah, I mean, especially the first 90 days, I think are so critical to understanding what you're walking into. You got to figure out what's working. You got to figure out what's not working. And to do that, you've really got to listen to not only your team members, but all of their clients, and really get the hard feedback and understand how can we get better? How can we serve better in a lot of ways? Once you have that and you kind of figure out where it is, you got to align what current state is against where the business is going overall and making sure, first off, that your team is working on the right stuff, right? So is there a legal strategy or strategic plan that aligns with the overall business strategy? And so that your people can have a kind of a direct line of sight on what they're working on day to day and how that's enabling and unlocking where the business is trying to go overall. Without that plan, I think it's really difficult for people to understand and to all start to work in the same direction on the right stuff that's the business has designated as these are the things that are going to move the needle for us. So let's all get behind it.
Got it. Okay. So so that was love that. Any kind of like so when people use the word strategy, sometimes I'm like, all right, what does that mean? So like when you come into a place and you're like, all right, our legal strategy needs to align with the business.
Mhm.
What does that look like? Is it something like so my examples all come from tech. Of course, all our listeners know it's like, okay, what's our strategy to get XYZ regulation overturned or what have you? But like in other industries, that means different things. Like, is there anything where it's like, and maybe it's even just like, hey, we're reviewing every single NDA and we're not going to do that. Like, I don't know what it means for your business, but anything to make that kind of strategy alignment concrete. Any examples you might be able to share?
Yeah. So, I'll use an example. Let's assume that you're in a business that has a pretty significant competitive threat, and your product development teams are working on that from an innovation standpoint. But what is the business and legal team doing to support the business on how we're positioning ourselves in the market. Can we be more aggressive with our marketing claims? Can we be more aggressive with their advertising claims? Are there avenues that we might be able to tap into that we haven't even thought of? Maybe perhaps from a a trade group standpoint, or even maybe from, can we get some, if there's sort of industry standards out there, is there a way that we can help to shape those or understand so that perhaps there's a competitive advantage given to one or the other? So more on that kind of advocacy side of things. But that's the type of stuff that you want to really start thinking through on, if this is where we want to go, how are we thinking through that? Another example is we want geographic expansion. Fantastic. That's great. What's our team doing to enable that? Moving into another country is a big deal. And how are we helping to set that up, move that as expeditiously as possible, understanding the landscape they're walking into? So if it's a country, for example, that could potentially have higher risks than what the business teams are otherwise used to operating in, how do we teach them to operate in that landscape as opposed to, and there's a way to do those things compliantly, how do you teach them and give them the tools so they understand what they're doing and can help the business and move as expeditiously and efficiently as possible?
That's great. So you mentioned risk, and you mentioned, maybe you dial it down or you dial it up, your risk awareness, depending on what's going on. What are some situations where you were maybe supporting that aggressive growth or operational change in a business? And, I realize, like, confidentiality, obviously, but like, to the extent you can, like, how do you manage that risk while supporting that aggressive growth, or vice versa? Maybe, you've had situations where you've needed to be a little bit more risk conscious and be a little bit more cautious. Any to share there?
Yeah, sure. So, I started my career as a litigator, and and it's probably not your typical pathway to the GC, route, but I found it to be extraordinarily helpful because I felt like my risk analysis got shaped pretty precisely early on. I do think there's some times where you have a perspective in-house that the risk of litigation is one that really governs a lot of decision making, and I don't really view it that way. I view it as one of the risks, right? And typically, when you're fearing litigation, you're fearing, if we take this action, we might get sued. Right. And that can sometimes cloud the conversation to ignoring what could be an even greater risk, which is, what if we don't take this action?
Exactly.
What's the risk of standing still here? What's the risk to the business? And oftentimes, in my view, I think that can be the greater risk here. And so sometimes that can play out in the perspective of, do you have the right talent there? Do you have the right people who you think, or the right role structure that you think can set this forth? And a lot of times too, even if you do end up with litigation, there's 1,000 exit ramps that you can take to kind of mitigate that on the backside as well. And by the same token, there's risk inherent in every decision that is made, right? And I wish I had one, but I don't. I don't have a magic wand to immunize the business. So it's got to be a really honest conversation with the business team, right? To say, here are the 20 things that could possibly happen. I actually think we're at risk of maybe these two or three, and let's figure out a plan to how do we mitigate against those two or three, and then see what we can do with otherwise to help drive the growth objectives that the business has. But I think sometimes if you stop too soon in that conversation and discussion, you just get stuck on, oh my God, there's 20 things that might happen. And then that paralyzes the decision-making process. And that often is not the right result for the business overall.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, in the security context, there's a thing that's like, okay, the most secure software does nothing, right? And so it's like this idea that the stasis itself is a risk, or of not taking action is a risk. So in that scenario, in your personal journey as an attorney, it's amazing that you're a litigator. I actually think I think ex-litigators make great GCs. I was one as well. And a lot of folks, come from that background. Savon Whiteley at Square, and others. It's been great to see the GC become, David Zapolsky at Amazon was a litigator famously. But I guess question on that idea of risk is, like you said, okay, you've got the 20 risks. How are you presenting that to the business? So you said it's an evolution. Is it something where you tell your team members, so pretend that I work for you, Tricia, and I'm, relatively new attorney. If I see these 20 risks of opening up an office in India, or of, you know, um, taking a certain regulatory position, and I'm talking with the business about it, how do I go about that?
You've got to triage it. And if you give them what I'll call kind of the torts exam answer, where you're just flagging all the parade of horribles that can happen, right? You're going to lose them. You've got to speak in the language they understand, which is, hey, this isn't clear. It's gray here, and here's where I think it's going to end up. Here's where I think what actual issues we may have in coming towards us, and let's plan against those. With the caveat that, again, no magic wand, no crystal ball. We could, this could be something that we don't see, and that's where that trust factor has to come in with the leadership team to say, right, like this is how we understand the situation right now, but it could change tomorrow, and we'll adapt to that too. We'll figure it out as it goes forward with it. But you have to be really careful though, is that conversation, and this is where the coaching comes in with your team, that you don't open with, oh my God, here are the parade of, here's the
Here's the
25.
20 things, but we got it down to 2. Like, yeah, you can't do that. So, okay, that's interesting.
You're going to lose with
And
that.
so process wise, just really like drilling in, because this was a podcast for a lot of folks. A lot of us are in house and it's legal and friends. Like, okay, how do we, help our friends across the business? So in that scenario, all right, we're opening up India. There's 20 terrible things that could happen. Maybe 2 are a thing. I'm going to the meeting. What's your coaching tip?
The coaching tip is to come in with a plan, right? And address and say, look, guys, here's the reality of the situation. You've got to be able to, please don't in any way think that this needs to be a way that you're sugarcoating anything, right? We've
Sure,
got to
yeah, of course.
truth to power, have honest, really honest discussions, fervent debate, all of that has got to be there. But you open with, hey, look, this is what we want to do. Here's the 2 or 3 things that I think could happen here. And here's where I think we can mitigate what that looks like. And whether that is we can't get to those 2 or 3, what we want to do, the pathway you want it to, but maybe here's another option for us to do it. Or there's a way to, potentially get ahead of it, whether it's a customer issue that we think might raise concern. How do we leverage our business relationships with them, perhaps, that can try to mitigate it? But you have to think creatively on what it is. There are some times too, and please don't get me wrong, where you have to tell the business, we can't do this, right? This is stepping on a landmine. It's not worth the risk.
Yeah,
Here's
yeah,
why.
yeah. That's
But that's
amazing.
few and far between. More often than not, you're able to figure out a pathway to going forward with it.
So this isn't on the script, so I'm going to go slightly off script, but I love this. More often than not, you can figure out a way. So have you seen, how do you help people be creative? And like, as lawyers, and now that we've got AI helping us spot the 20 risks, then it's like, okay, how do we get creative in getting to that solution? So
Mhm.
what do you do, either personally or with your team to encourage that and to have that approach?
I mean, with the team, it's really thinking through like, okay, let's turn the question on its head. How realistic do you think this, or how possible it is that you think the risk is actually going to materialize, right? So are we talking 100%? Are we talking 5%? Because that really governs where you're going to go. And if you're somewhere on the 50 plus, that's something you really should be able to flag for. And then you start looking through and saying, well, is it something that we might be able to again come up with another solution for? So I'll give you an example. And you also want to teach people to again potentially be a little aggressive on that. And so there's been some prior roles that I had. We were facing a fairly significant competitive threat, and the competitor was um, pretty formidable, pretty litigious, pretty aggressive in kind of striking out first. But there was some really good data that we had, and we really had a really strong story behind, our claims in the market. But there was this kind of fear factor, right? Is it worth the litigation? Look what they've done to others. Do we really want that? And the reality was, in that instance, when we started to really map through what is it that we're losing by not from a market share standpoint, from a revenue standpoint, by not potentially taking on the potential risk that we might get a lawsuit that's valid or not from somebody who just that's what they do. It really started to, kind of equalize the playing field for us. And then you got to figure out, okay, how do we do this knowing we're going to get this lawsuit
Yeah.
in a way that we're in a super defensible position? And when you've got the backing on, especially when you've got good data on your side, I mean,
Right.
that's a situation I'll take on any day.
I love that. I think of, now, so you were in consumer goods, right? So Kimberly-Clark makes a lot of really recognizable brands. And, I think about, I read the lawsuit. There was a lawsuit where Build-A-Bear made basically a doll that looked like Squishamallows, right? So Squishamallows, these pillows that are super popular. And you can imagine in-house counsel at Build-A-Bear absolutely knew that that lawsuit was coming, but yet that line of business, that product is doing incredibly well. They knew what the market wanted. They had people begging, their users basically begging for a softer Build-A-Bear, and they launch it. And so then it's like, okay, what are we going to do in advance to make sure that, it's marketed in such a way that it's not using the Squishamallow name, that it looks different enough, and all these other things where, even for me as an IP attorney, seeing those fair use claims, super fun. We could put it in the show notes, but basically there was a lawsuit and, Build-A-Bear is defending it. And that's something where you're going to look at creatively, just like you described. You're going to look at that revenue, and then you're going to look at, okay, we're going to defend the case. It's going to cost us X, Y, or Z, but we're going to win it. And by the way, this is a new line of business. We got a, squishy bear. So
Yeah.
yeah, good fun. I
That's
love that.
exactly what I think is the unlock for folks because, again, that conversation could have gotten stuck in the very beginning to say, oh God, we're really treading into some difficult waters here. And frankly, that's our job, right? There's no like free, clear lanes anywhere. We've got to figure out how to navigate around on those rocks that may exist.
Exactly. No, I love that. And the other one, I recently heard, so I was at a tech GC event and they had David Hyman, the GC of Netflix, and he said he recounted the story of when the company decided to, Netflix became available globally. Like they just pressed go and they were like, kind of, F it, we're going to be available globally. And you can imagine that analysis being a lot like this because, the number of regulations. Do you have any sense for your last couple of employers, how many regulations globally you're even subject to?
I mean, it certainly depends on the industry that you're in with that. And I've been in some regulated industries and non-regulated, but it's, it's a morass. And that's why you need to make sure that you've got the right structure underneath you with it. And, and some, by the way, some regulatory schemes change really, really fast overnight. Some have the ability to be retroactive in their application. And so you need to, if that's the landscape that you're working with, right, in the country you've decided you want to be in, part of the job is how do you figure out how to navigate this and know that it's not a landscape we can control, but how do we maybe make some changes within our own business to be able to make this less of a concern going forward.
I love that. So you mentioned kind of structuring. Let's talk about legal teams. So you've come in either as a new GC or head of a division GC a few times, and you've restructured legal as part of that. Like we talked before, and you mentioned that you've done that. How do you approach that process, and what do you do, and what are you optimizing for?
So, again, when we start with you figure out what should the team be working on and having that, laddering directly into what the business strategy is. Once you've got that aligned, you then need to figure out a couple things. One, do they have the capacity right now to work on that? And more often than not, the answer is no. Typically, you have more work than you have people to do it. And so you've got to be super efficient on how you are deploying those resources. There's only a finite amount of time that every person has to devote to the job. So you got to make sure every hour is working in your favor. And so one of the critical things I do on the front end is look at and say, okay, what other work is coming in that may be choking the team, right? It's lower value work. The high value stuff is the strategic stuff that you want to go after. And so how do I free them up to have the mind space, the time in their calendars to be able to go do that? And so you got to get really ruthless about how do you handle the low value work that often still needs to get done? How efficient can I be with that? And some of that may include, for example, not doing that work at the level you're doing it right now. So I've walked into teams before where they have been reviewing 100% of the contracts that are signed, period. And while that shows a lot in terms of how valued legal may be as a business partner, it's probably not the right risk analysis, right? There's some contracts, low value, maybe low risk, that we can take, the idea if the bottom falls out on those contracts, it's not going to be detrimental to the business. So how do I optimize those and to the fullest extent? AI is a great tool on some of that, providing, typically what we're able to do is provide some, templatized formats for the business to use and say, look, if you're within these parameters and you negotiate with this template, go for it. We don't need to see it. This needs to, you can go ahead and get to contract a heck of a lot faster as well. Or maybe there's some, hey, if you have some disagreement on a few provisions, here's some alternatives. There's 1,000 ways you can do that. The other piece is, I think leveraging third-party partners that you have is the work that you're doing internally that frankly you have external support that should be doing for you, and are you getting the full value out of that as well? And then thirdly, is there work that maybe your team is doing that really probably is maybe they're checking up or on other teams that you should be standing up fully. So I've had situations before where I've been told that my team they were kind of the last stop for editing on anything because, quote, they were really good at proofreading. And I'm like, that's fantastic, but I need 50 more people if really that's where we're going to go. We've got to have, others on the team kind of handle that piece of it. And this is the role we're playing in this review process. And then once you get kind of that, like how should the workflow be going through and what is the workflow that should be going through? Then you start to look and say, okay, do I have the right people in the right roles on that? And more often than not, there's going to be some tweaking on it. And it doesn't mean that you're moving people out of the organization. It just means maybe you're shifting what they're focused on. And the interesting thing about in-house work is it is an awesome opportunity to just pick up and learn as you go through it, right? And I'll use myself as an example. I've been placed in roles where I had no prior experience with it. And, you got to figure out how do you jump in, roll your sleeves up and figure out how to add value on this pretty quickly. And so when I hire for my team, it's very rare that I'm able to hire somebody and just kind of plug and play them into the role I'm looking for, right? Because more often than not, I may be looking for something that doesn't exist on the marketplace. I've got a gap on my team for IP and union negotiations. Well, that doesn't exist anywhere. So what I'm looking for there is somebody who's smart, who's hungry, who has some substantive expertise in maybe one or two of those areas and is willing to learn. And the rest of it I can teach them as we get into it. But that adaptability and that agility to kind of run to whatever fire it is that the business needs you to put out, that piece of it I think is really critical when you're designing teams.
I love that. I love that. I also, it's like, I think, again, my favorite reference being tech, it's always like, oh, there's always something new. But no, there's always something new in every business, right? So like, the tariff situation, I know you and I chatted last fall and that was affecting your business, very much. And, all this stuff, like even areas like you mentioned unions, we've got the political situation affects that too. And just like the ability to learn, like I still remember for me, a little story, I joined Amazon and the CVAA, Communications and Video Accessibility Act, had just come out. It was 2010. And it was like, congrats, you're an expert on this now. So, and that was a great career opportunity because that was how I ended up working on Alexa and all these other devices and really getting this incredibly cross-functional view of the business and developing that trust. Yeah, that resonates tremendously. I'm not surprised that I guess I've always admired you as a GC. And so hearing you say that, it's great to hear. Awesome. All right. So let's see. How about cross-functional work? So you mentioned like, you were the editor for your team was the copy editor for the business. I've done that role. I had a CMO, same thing, tell me like, why are you so good at copy editing? It's like, well, law school. But anyways, how do you, in that context of figuring out what the highest leverage work for your team while still maintaining client service and working across functions? So what's your advice on working cross functionally?
I mean, you have to partner with them, right? And they've got to view you as you have to be the legal expert. Don't get me wrong on that, but you've got to be the business partner to them. So they're thinking of you as a thought partner, a strategic, somebody they can come in and bounce, an issue that has nothing to do with legal off and just get your judgment on that. And I think, there's a worry if they're not serving in that type of capacity. That does not mean though, and I think lawyers are often, especially those of us who came from law firms, we're kind of reflexively trained to answer yes to whatever the client asks you to do, right? And even if it's not the highest and best use of your time, or it's not really value add for the business or any of that, and you just don't have the capacity to be able to, it's not the business model internally to do that. It really isn't, because unless you've got a team of 125 lawyers that can do that, that's the law firm model. right? Where you are in-house is you've got to make sure that you're getting to moving through efficiency as quickly as possible. And, sometimes that requires that other teams, you do have those conversations with them to say, hey, look, we'd so love to continue editing, for example, here, but we're not do that, and let's talk through and how do we collectively solve this problem. I think we can get into troubles when if you approach that conversation to kind of say, well, it's not my team is going to do it, and kind of it feels like you're tossing it back over the fence onto the other team. You got to work through it and collaborate it because somebody needs it edited, right? And so how do we work together to be able to stand that up a little bit more from a easy one step shop as opposed to kind of viewed as like self-help and walk away.
Yeah, that's great. I love it. And it's funny because that example resonates with me because I kind of like copy editing. And then it's like, well, okay, and it's like, and it's definitely when people give me the kudos and whatever. So reflecting on that as an IC and then obviously eventually as a GC, it's like, okay, marketing should learn to like, copy edit their own stuff. Although I've heard AI is really good at that. So pro tip, use AI for that. So
Yes.
good stuff. All right. So what about, let's talk about M&A. So you've done a lot of M&A. You were at ServiceMaster. If I'm a GC or if I'm an in-house lawyer new to M&A, what's kind of like your like M&A works better when you blah?
Honestly, I think M&A is such an incredible opportunity and it's just an exciting, there's an infusion happening, right? Whatever's happening, whether it's a divestiture or an M&A or whatever it is, the business is going to look different after that's done. And that's a really unique ability to be able to help shape. Right. More often, very different litigation when all of the facts have already kind of fallen into place and you're just trying to tell the story of what happened. Here you actually get to shape the story, and that's super exciting to be a part of. And so, if you're new to it, I would, again, like anything else you're doing, roll your sleeves up, right? Get immersed in it, dig in on all the due diligence and figure out kind of where start with the lens of okay, once this is completed, what do I have to do, what's going to be on my list that we're going to need to look at. And so that starts to shape like here's where we are as a company right now, here's where the target may look like, and what do we need to do to reconcile that. And I've been in deals where the target looks a lot better maybe sometimes than where we are, and we're like, fantastic, this is exactly great. But start to think through like, if I am the one who has to solve these issues on the backside, how am I identifying them? And then B, what could potentially be the plan? I think the area where you can see sometimes M&A going wrong is on the integration. And there's a lot of philosophies on what that looks like and how you do it from bolt-on to full integration. But typically, if you are acquiring a company, there's something about them that you really want, and it's a value. It's a benefit to where you are right now. Often if you're, my experience is that when you try to come in and sort of the larger consumes the smaller, you're losing some of that value of the deal that you attracted you in the first place. So figuring out what that blend is and what that balance is and how to integrate, that's always where the secret sauce is.
So you talked about M&A. That was great advice. The secret sauce in M&A. You've also done some really interesting things that a lot of our listeners I think will find fascinating: crisis management and cybersecurity readiness. On either of those topics, what's your system or framework for those?
Yeah. Well, and I think cybersecurity is just one type of crisis, and frankly, it's probably the most prevalent type of crisis that most people are going to experience just in the world we're in, right? And it's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when. The bad guys in this space are prolific, and it's just a matter of it's kind of a war of attrition, right? Who's next and who are they going to go after? So, with that piece of it, you just have to be ready. It is going to happen. And again, kind of on that prep of, hey, we know we're going to get sued on something. Let's put ourselves in the best defensible position. Same mindset on this, right? We know we're going to have an incident because incidents are happening everywhere. So how do we put ourselves in the best position when it happens? And so what I would start with is, the last thing you want to do when it happens is to be figuring out what you should be doing in that moment. You want to be able to have that kind of your muscle memory already in place, your team already in place, and so it's just a matter of dealing with the situation when it happens. So, for example, have all your vendors lined up. Know who the first phone call is to outside counsel, who your insurance broker is, who your threat negotiator may be. All of that you want to have set up. You want to make sure, for example, all your vendors are set up they're on your panel that are approved with all of your carriers, so you're not dealing with that kind of nonsense as it's going forward. You also want to make sure that your internal team is ready and that people know they're on the internal team and that they're ready to go. With the caveat that typically, if you're in this situation, your normal means of communicating with your internal team are not going to be available to you. So, for example, do you have your cell phone numbers for not only people on the crisis team, but maybe several layers down. Because while you're dealing with the crisis, you also need to make sure that you're getting your business stood up and ready and back up as quickly as it can be. And a lot of times those are operational guys who wouldn't be involved on the crisis team. And so if I don't have if my systems are all paralyzed, how am I getting in touch with somebody maybe in the field that I need to go do X, Y, or Z to handle getting the field back up and ready? And then on top of that, you need to make sure you're understanding with how the board is going to be brought in, when they get brought in, at what point you start to trigger a crisis. So you're going to be getting thousands of these flags through your IT team on a very regular basis. At what point do you start to convene this? Like, when is that trigger happening? And then you want to practice. Again, I would highly recommend doing at least one tabletop cross-functionally, not just within the IT team or not just within the legal team, but cross-functionally, get your ops teams there, your commercial teams there, get your supply chain involved. Well, so that we all understand exactly what's happening here and you understand kind of the leadership and the communications cadence as well too. It's amazing what comes out, by the way, when you start to do your scenario planning and your tabletop exercises and how much that overlap and bolster what you think may be a good process altogether. And you start to see the need on the backside. We had an interesting situation and we used a third party, by the way, too, which I would recommend kind of run the tabletops. And they had a situation that frankly we hadn't thought about, which was in one of their prior clients, they had an attack and the systems were shut down. There was a notice to employees, and of course it always happens weekend as well, right? Or holiday when people are not normal working hours. So because the systems were disabled, they were trying to let the general employee population know, hey, we know that this particular system is down, working on it before as they're trying to assess the full magnitude of the threat. Well, an employee tweeted about that and ended up, that can kind of pick up and go viral. And suddenly all of this kind of external, like, wait, what's going on? How's this happening? So, that highlighted for us, and maybe we need to kind of strengthen some of our approaches and kind of with employees and what they're doing with, internal communication. Something we would probably never have thought about before, but it really highlighted grows of it going forward. But I think the bottom line with all of this is that when you are in a crisis, it is all consuming. It's all hands on deck. Everything else, goes by the wayside. The last thing you want to happen is that people are learning on that job. You want them to learn through it
Yeah.
or another.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of these like, even the very tactical, like making sure that your law firms are impaneled and you don't have a conflict. Like literally, because every minute counts. And then, the other thing you said reminded me there was a really interesting. So I was at Cruise, which was autonomous vehicles, and they had a crisis in the form of, a struck pedestrian. And come to find that there was a Slack channel with, I think it was like 40 people in it. Footage of the incident was dropped, and it turns out that no one person watched it for 4 hours. And it's the kind of thing that you hear about afterwards, and you're like, no, okay, they could have said, like, okay, Jane Doe, X person, you are the first to watch this, Brian Doe, you're the second, and like literally had that. And it ended up being something that, like, in retrospect is like horrifying, but then, with some advanced planning, it could have been like literally tagging people to those very specific tasks that you can predict in advance could happen.
That's a fantastic example of it, exactly, because you can see, and there was no ill will and nobody not watching it. They're completely consumed with everything else. It's just not something that was on somebody's list to.
Exactly, exactly. And yeah, so I think like that very detailed, like, well, I'm excited to actually have AI create a checklist for what you said, Tricia. So
Yeah.
yeah, so let's talk real quick about AI. What's your view on AI? Have you used legal AI? How are you using it to do some of the things we talked about?
I think it's is not using it is almost to the same in my view of saying I'm not going to use the internet 25 years ago or 30 years ago, right? It's just an essential. And again, to my point of having too much work and not enough people, you've got to get as efficient as possible with the heads that you have, using it in the right way. can expedite your timing on, turning around relatively routine items, or even, on prep that would otherwise, you would otherwise consume your time with that. I was reading the other day that I think there's a study that just came out from Harvard that showed that on average it's giving, I think it was law firm lawyers, about 4 hours back per week. And you think if you're billing a 40-hour week, that's 10% of your time, right? And getting a 10% FTE on my team, like that's a massive, massive boost on any front with it. And especially as you're starting, now the critical thing is making sure that that 10% time is really used effectively, right? So if it's something where I am I'm not, I just kind of expect that, we get this new AI tool and it works beautifully on the front end, it's going to fail miserably. But I think I mentioned this to you previously. I had heard Ethan Mollick speak, who runs the AI lab at Wharton, and his admonition has just stuck with me that you've got to think of it as a new hire on your team, right? And if you have a brand new person who starts and you just set them free, they're not going to be effective, right? You've got to coach, you've got to give context, you've got to give background, you've got to, and also you've got to give feedback. So if as you start using AI, it's not giving you the answers that you want, you've got to speak to them like a human being would and say, this is not what I want, not just redo the prompt, which is our typical response when we're using something like Google or a search engine on that. But really that kind of training mechanism, I think, is critical. I also am a huge fan of using legal specific AI tools as opposed to consumer specific AI tools. I think the efficiency on building that knowledge base, not only from a proprietary standpoint, but you want them training in the same context that we're operating in. And language, legal language is very different. Legal context is very different than it often is in the wider world overall. Now, the other piece to it is you got to make sure that you've got the security, there's a thousand horribles that can go wrong here, on making sure you've got the right security measures in place and having some conversations with your IT team and make sure they're comfortable with everything as it's going forward too. But all of that to me seems like something that you can, there's a pathway forward on all of it.
Love it. All right. So we're going to go to we're going to look at the lightning round. So basically, what is your favorite part of being an attorney, Tricia?
I really like to build things as part of the leadership team. And there's a different, to be able to come in and figure out here's where we are right now and look at the growth potential, the white space we have on where we can go as a business and how do we figure out how we get there. That to me is the fun stuff. It's the real unlock.
I
And
love
that,
that. The builder. So
yeah,
good. I mean, just to be a builder, because I don't think people think of that as a lawyer. And so I think that's wonderful. What about what's one tool, mindset, or practice that keeps you grounded?
I think it's that it's really important to potentially crawl before you try to run. And I've made that mistake before where you come in and you can see 25 things that need to get done, right? There are these fires in front of you, and it's a good, or maybe you've got 25 great ideas to go after, which is an awesome problem to have, right? But if you try to go after all 25 of them at once, you're not going to have the resources, you're not going to have the time, you're not going to be able to be effective on anything. You spread the peanut butter way too thin. So figuring out what are the three best of these 25 great ideas to go after them, get them taken care, really embed them and use them from that needle mover perspective and make sure that they really are impactful in the business. That requires, though, that you park those other 22 ideas. And that's a hard thing to do, not only just in, when you're developing your strategic plan, it's really hard to do when you've got clients calling you about those 22 other ideas. And that's why it's so important to get alignment on the front end on the plan to say, understand these are awesome, but we aligned that this is where we're going to go. Or maybe it's something where now we got to, check and adjust, and we've got to move from these three are not the best ideas anymore. We want to add the additional, or we need more heads and let's go after it. There's a thousand conversations you can have on how that all looks, but really being choiceful and careful on the front end before you actually go after it, I think is really, really important. And it'll set you up for better success on long.
Love that. Those other 22 ideas, it's painful. but I've seen your advice again and again. Super timely. Before we wrap, Tricia, any final thoughts to leave with the legal leaders listening, whether they're in-house, scaling their first team, sitting at a board table the first time? Anything we missed?
The one piece that I would really recommend is that you got to teach your team to be business partners, and who happen to have legal skills. And by that, the language of business is numbers. And a lot of us, a lot of lawyers, myself included, originally went to law school to avoid numbers altogether. And if we come in speaking in the way that is normal to us, we're not communicating with our clients. And so they have to understand the dynamics of the P&L. They really do. And that takes time, that takes effort, that takes a lot of self-study. But take the time to really understand and learn that and ask the questions, right? On, okay, if we do this in an inflationary environment, why is there this impact on this? Seems counterintuitive to me, for example. But go through and really take the time to meet with your finance team and understand how that all works. And that'll help so much in your team shaping your advice about legal issues in a way that gets communicated, and the risk analysis gets communicated in a way that will get understood in a way by your team most effectively.
That Tricia, where can folks find you if they'd like to follow you or your work or get in touch?
I'm on LinkedIn, and I'd love to hear from anybody. That'd be great.
Amazing. All right. Well, hey, thanks so much. It's been such a pleasure having you on. It's really, I just like, I'm absorbing all the advice and shaking my head about of everything that you said. Thanks again. This is a pleasure. This is my conversation with Tricia Kinney, from boardrooms to global operations to cybersecurity. So her approach to legal leadership, we've heard a lot of great thoughts. It's a model of being strategic while also having that operational clarity and your checklist and your 25 things you're doing. Just super inspiring. I mean, whether you're a first-time GC or looking to scale your influence, a lot we can learn from Tricia kind of across the business. I'm sure that I'll take a wild guess and say she's probably hiring at some point. So you can come to her for mentorship or great leadership. And thanks again for being here. To hear more stories like this, follow wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Tricia Kinney. You can find me on LinkedIn or at gc.ai to learn more about how we support in-house counsel, building an AI and beyond. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.